The steel industry isn't in favor of free enterprise. It wants tariffs, it wants import quotas. Again, I don't blame them. They're trying to protect their own interests. But the rest of us are fools if we let them get away with it. There's a big hue and cry about the steel industry and about imposing tariffs on, higher tariffs or import quotas on steel. Now, every ecologist in this country ought to be on the right side of that issue, which is a free trade issue. If Japan chooses to subsidize the export of clean air to the United States, why should we object? Isn't that what it's doing when it sends steel here? But here, we have this great hue and cry that we should somehow or other subsidize steel, either by tariffs or quotas or in other ways, to enable steel to produce both its product and its pollution at home. Let's see if we can get one more question in.
Yes, so you mentioned about the imports of steel.
Yeah.
I'd like to allude to that. We hear from the American steel industry that in Japan, for instance, steel producers are producing at less than cost with support of the government so as to keep employment up there. And as a result, the American steel industry here is not going to be able to compete. So they're going to shut down, and we're going to have higher unemployment here. What is your answer to that?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's a very easy answer. Because I may say the answer I'm giving is not my answer. It was the answer that was given by Adam Smith, the man whose face appears on my tie, I may say. It was given by Adam Smith in 1776 in The Wealth of Nations. From that time to this, hardly any professional economist has believed in tariffs or protection or anything but free trade. But the answer is very straightforward. Let us suppose for a moment that the Japanese flood us with steel. That will reduce employment in the American steel industry, no doubt. However, it will increase employment elsewhere in America. We will pay for that steel with dollars. What will the Japanese do with the dollars they get for the steel? They aren't going to burn them. They aren't going to tear them up. If they would, that would be best of all. Because there's nothing we can produce more cheaply than green pieces of paper. And if they were willing to send us steel and just take back green pieces of paper, I can't imagine a better deal. But they're not going to do that. They're not stupid. They're smart people. They're going to use those dollars to buy goods and services. They're going to spend them. In the process of spending them, they may spend them directly in the United States, and that directly provides employment in the United States. They may spend them in Brazil or in Germany or in China or anywhere else. But whoever gets them in turn is going to spend them. So the dollars that we spend for the steel will find their way back to the U.S. as demand for U.S. goods and services. You will have less employment in the steel industry. You will have more employment in the industries producing the goods we export. Overall, total employment will not be affected. But overall, the American consumer will be benefited because he will get the steel more cheaply and the goods made from the steel more cheaply than he otherwise would. That's the benefit to the American consumer. Now, why is the steel industry and similar industries, why are they so effective in their campaigns for protection? Because of a very common problem that affects not only this but lots else, and that is the difference between the visible and the invisible. The people who are going to lose their jobs in steel are very visible. They're a collective group. You can name their names. Suppose we restrict imports from Japan. Then people are going to lose their jobs in these export industries. They will be widely spread over the country. You and I couldn't name one person. But that doesn't mean they're any less real. But the greater propaganda effect of the steel industry is because you can set the visible is a more potent political force than the invisible people who will lose their jobs. I urge on those people who think there's some sense to the steel industry argument to consider it in a more absurd setting. You very often bring out the logic of an argument by carrying it to an extreme. You know, you could have a great employment in the city of Logan, Utah, of people growing bananas in hothouses. If we had a high enough tariff on the import of bananas, it could become profitable to build hothouses and grow bananas in those hothouses. That would give employment. Would that be a sensible thing to do? If that isn't sensible, then neither is it sensible to artificially restrict the import of steel. Now, with respect to the charge that the Japanese government is subsidizing the export of steel, number one is very dubious that it's true, but suppose it were true. Then that would be a foolish thing for the Japanese to do from their own point of view. But why should we object to their giving us foreign aid? We've given them quite a bit. Thank you.
Our complex social tools of production make and do things, and, more importantly, make and do things that people want, regardless of what might be regarded as their consumerist triviality. No centrally planned economy produces a selection of shampoos or toothbrushes or automatic watch winders or kite surfing kites or lightweight bicycles or video games. A haughty-minded and judgmental social justice advocate might dismiss such hyper-production as trivial, but is still very likely to spend hours per day texting his or her friends desirable political cliches on expensive iPhones and Androids. One man's meat is another man's poison. It is by no means clear who should judge whether something that someone else desires may be acceptably produced in a world where absolute privation still exists. Because our hierarchical organizations make and do things that people want, and because people differ in their competence in doing so, different people experience different demand for their services. We adjudicate such demand with pay. This is the alternative to slavery. If you are producing things that people want, then you are entitled to charge what people are willing to pay for your services, or to refuse to provide such services at your whim if you choose. You get this privilege because what you provide for other people has value, and it is therefore useful for other people to encourage you to continue to provide it. They don't have to buy what you're offering either, any more than you have to produce it. Although that's not the very definition of freedom, it certainly constitutes an important element of freedom. Because some people are more competent at making or doing those things, they can demand a higher price for their participation. This is because of what they're offering, not because of what they intrinsically deserve. Let's say it again. It isn't what you deserve for intrinsic reasons that determines your outcome. It's the worth that others attribute to your offerings. Think of an offering on eBay. No seller says, I am Azerbaijan and my mother has Alzheimer's and I'm not well educated, but I'm tall and strong, although not very attractive, and I was bullied as a child, but I'm quite musical, although I only have one friend, and I'm slightly overweight and prone to anxiety, so you have to pay me $50 for my second-hand crock pot. They say, instead, I have this item, and you don't care who I am, and I don't care who you are, except that I will describe it honestly and ship it, and you will pay for it if we can agree on a mutually beneficial price. That's trade. The reward runs both ways. Trade is not charity. Trade is mutually beneficial. Trade does not and cannot rectify historical or biological injustices. It can only partly and momentarily satisfy the people engaged in the particular trade, because the problem of distribution is so complex that it has to be outsourced to the collective intelligence. No person, group of persons, or imaginable computational device can perform the calculations of price. The measurements can't even be made. This is because the price of anything is dependent on the price of everything else. And to make it worse, is always shifting. Flawed as the free market system is, we don't have anything better.
My question has to do with the category of globalization and worker fear, as you mentioned in your speech. Your thoughts on the offshoring of technology jobs and also the H-1B visas, 1.3 million in the last 3 years that have displaced technology workers here in the U.S., including me?
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, there's an interesting op-ed in the New York Times about this morning by a very good economist, Jagdish Bhagwati, who's also not only a fine economist, but a very decent person who really wants to help the poor and done important things. And what he's saying is that people who are objecting to outsourcing just don't have their economics straight. If they understood economics, they would know it's a good thing. And why is it a good thing? Well, because it increases efficiency, and efficiency increases the economic pie, and that's good for all of us. And if you don't allow corporations to outsource, they may die, and then there won't be any jobs for anyone, and so on. Well, and then he says, we have a very innovative society, so we should be able to develop means of overcoming this. Well, everything he says is true in some abstract model of the international economy, which has absolutely no resemblance to reality. But in that model, it's true, and you can probably prove a theorem about it. In the actual economy, it's very innovative, but not because of private enterprise. It's innovative, yes, because of massive state intervention, exactly what's blocked for everyone else by the so-called globalization rules. So we're going to do it because we do anything we like, but others can't do it. Furthermore, that's the whole history of the modern world. That's why India was a disaster and Britain became rich. It's because of those relationships. And so it goes. So in the real world, yes, we're innovative, but not for his reasons. Furthermore, even on his own terms, objecting to let's take this abstract model that he's talking about. Suppose that corporations die in the United States. Well, it just means they're inefficient. So that means that he and I and you can all get kicked out of our institutions because they're just not competitive, and we can apply for jobs as janitors at 80 hours a week, no pay, or get locked into factories and so on, by factories owned in more efficient places like Thailand and China and so on. Maybe that'll increase the economic pie, So why not advocate that? I mean, who cares if the corporations here die? Furthermore, the outsourcing has nothing to do with economic efficiency. Outsourcing is one of the operations that take place within command economies. The economy is run by a network of command economies called corporations. I mean, what goes on internal to a corporation or a mega corporation is not free trade. It's command economy. A corporation is a totalitarian institution. It has a board of directors at the top, a manager, he gives orders, everyone else follows them down at the bottom. At the very bottom, if you're lucky, you can rent yourself to it and get a job. And if you're sufficiently propagandized, you may even buy some of the junk they produce and so on. But it's certainly has nothing to do with what any classical economist would have called a free market. Outsourcing is just part of the technique. Outsourcing is internal to the corporation, right? The corporation picks some supplier to outsource to and keeps them under control, because then they can get much cheaper labor, hideous working conditions, don't have to worry about environmental controls. They get inputs to themselves, which are very cheap. That increase, for those of you who've studied economics, you know that increases productivity. If you get artificially cheap inputs, that increases productivity, because productivity is measured in terms of, value produced divided by the number of workers. So you get nice measures of productivity, which have nothing to do with productivity. They just have to do with the fact that you've got 20-year-old women off the farms in China locked into factories and working until they die in a couple of years. That is very healthy for the economy. But it's all internal to big command economies. That's one of the reasons why the concept trade is so ridiculous. I mean, what's called trade would certainly not have been called trade by Adam Smith. Outsourcing happens to send goods across the border into the United States, but it's under the control of a command economy. In fact, a network of command economies, which work the way I just quoted, the oligopolistic competition and strategic integration. And the same is true of most of what's called trade. I mean, nobody really studies this much, so you don't have really accurate numbers. But if you take the numbers that are guessed at by economists who look at it, take, say, NAFTA. One of the great things about NAFTA is supposed to have been that it increased trade between the U.S. and Mexico. Well, it certainly increased cross-border transfers of material objects. But is that trade? Well, it depends. It turns out that the percentage of interaction that's intra-firm, internal to a command economy, went from about 50% before NAFTA to about 2/3 after NAFTA. That's not trade any more than if GM shifts something from Indiana to Illinois. Happens across an international border so that you can take advantage of rotten working conditions and low wages and no environmental constraints, but it's no more trade than if the Kremlin moved something from Poland to Hungary or something like that. And in fact, it's very possible, if anybody ever bothered to study it, that actual trade has even declined since NAFTA. I mean, nobody studies it because it's the wrong questions to ask in the ideological framework that we're supposed to accept. But if you did ask it, you might very well find that, just as it turns out after NAFTA that, another great thing about NAFTA for Mexico is that foreign investment shot up, which it did. But a little footnote is that total investment declined because Mexican investment declined even faster than foreign investment went up for the simple reason that Mexican businesses can't compete with highly subsidized U.S. Corporate systems. So when you go back to the outsourcing story, it's just, in an abstract world, what he's describing is true. In the real world, it just has nothing to do with what's going on. Should we approve of it? Well, that's not the only question. There are other options. For example, another option is to work to improve working conditions, labor standards, environmental conditions, and so on in the places to which they are outsourcing. Okay, that'll tend to equalize the conditions. Is that a utopian measure? Not at all. It's been used. You take a look at the European Union. Before the European Union integrated, substantial efforts were made and substantial costs were assumed to raise the level of the poorer countries, Portugal, Spain, and Greece, to raise labor standards, raise wages, improve conditions, enough, and get to the northern standards, but enough so that when they finally integrated, there wasn't a very severe blow against the wages and living standards of northern workers. Well, that's because they have a kind of social market economy and a more or less functioning democratic system. And the same could have been done with regard to NAFTA. In fact, it was proposed by the U.S. labor movement, but never entered the discussion. And the same, because corporate media are against it and the elites are against it. And the same could be true of the whole outsourcing story. So there are other options. It's not either let the command economies maximize their own profit and power, or else, you don't have a job. There are other options. first of all, we should avoid the term free trade because the agreements that are signed are not free trade agreements. They have highly protectionist elements. They're basically investor rights agreements. And they privilege investors and corporations and very high protective tariffs for major corporations. International intellectual property rights are essentially tariffs. And in many ways, and a lot of it doesn't even have to do with trade. So, for example, the so-called free trade agreements grant investors special rights in the countries where they invest. So if a U.S. company, say, invests in Mexico, they have to be treated like a Mexican company. That's got nothing to do with free trade. In fact, a lot of the interactions among countries aren't even trade in any reasonable sense. So take, say, U.S.-Mexico. Probably, corporations don't give us data, so it's guesswork. But probably about half of the commercial interactions across the border are actually internal to a multinational corporation. So say General Motors will assemble parts in a state, say Indiana, and send them to northern Mexico for assembly, and then return the car to Los Angeles for sale. That's called trade in both directions, but it isn't trade. It's an interaction inside a closed economy, namely the multinational corporation. So the free trade agreements aren't free trade agreements. They're something else. And they do have complex effects. I mean, one effect often is to increase poverty. So, for example, take, say, U.S.-Mexico. The North American so-called free trade agreement was signed in 1994. It was predicted pretty widely that this would be quite harmful to Mexican farmers, small business, working people, and so on. And indeed it has been. It's been valuable to the corporate system. It's been, in Mexico, it's led to a huge growth in the number of billionaires. On the other hand, for campesinos, peasants in agricultural work, predictably it undermined them. I mean, they may be perfectly efficient, but they can't compete with highly subsidized U.S. agribusiness. It's another respect in which it's not free trade. So they flock to the cities. There's less work for them in the cities because Mexican businesses can't compete with the U.S. multinationals. They come across the border, and you have what's called the immigration problem. This is the kind of effect that these neoliberal programs typically have. It leads to concentration of wealth, to high level of corruption, and to cutting back benefits for the general population and harming the workforce. So people are poorer or stagnating while wealth is accumulating in very few hands. Standard consequence, perfectly predictable, and it happens over and over, and it leads to popular uprisings.
So what can we do?
Have a democratic revolution. Actually, Korea is the last place where this question ought to be asked. After all, Korea had a quasi-fascist developmental state, and with a very courageous struggle, it was overthrown, the Chun dictatorship. So Korea led the way. It's not very far back. Easy to remember the lessons.